Israel strikes Gaza hospital, killing at least 20, including journalists, in Khan Younis. The Gaza conflict has once again taken a devastating turn as Israeli airstrikes hit the Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis, southern Gaza, on Monday, killing at least 20 people, including journalists, doctors, and civilians who were inside and around the facility. The hospital, which had been struggling to cope with the growing number of injured amid continuous bombardments, became the latest site of tragedy in a war that has now gripped the region for nearly a year. Witnesses described scenes of horror as the first strike tore into the hospital complex and a second strike hit moments later, targeting people who had rushed to help the wounded. Among the dead were 5 journalists, several medical staffs, and patients who had no means of escape. Survivors and rescue workers said the bombardment came without warning, leaving chaos in its wake. The emergency ward, already packed with patients suffering from war-related injuries, turned into a scene of blood and destruction. Medics rushed to save lives but were themselves killed or wounded in the attack. The Gaza Health Ministry said the strikes caused catastrophic damage to vital hospital infrastructure, including intensive care units, surgical wards, and electricity systems. Dozens of patients had to be evacuated under extreme duress, many of them severely injured, while families searched frantically for missing relatives among the debris. The strike has drawn immediate condemnation from international human rights organizations, media associations, and governments worldwide. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, issued a statement calling the deaths of 5 reporters an unacceptable attack on press freedom and a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. The journalists killed were affiliated with Reuters, the Associated Press, Al Jazeera, and local media outlets. They had been covering the mounting civilian toll of the war and documenting the worsening humanitarian crisis. Their deaths highlight the increasingly dangerous environment for journalists working in conflict zones, particularly in Gaza, where communications infrastructure has collapsed and safety guarantees have been virtually non-existent. Israel's military issued a brief statement acknowledging the strike and describing it as a tragic mishap. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed regret over the loss of life and said that a full investigation would be launched. The Israel Defense Forces (IDF) said their operation was aimed at targeting militants allegedly using the hospital vicinity for cover. But they insisted that journalists and medical workers were not intentionally targeted. "We take extraordinary measures to avoid civilian harm, but the complexity of this battlefield sometimes results in unintended casualties," an IDF spokesperson said. The statement, however, has done little to quell anger and disbelief among Palestinians, aid groups, and international observers. Palestinian officials rejected the Israeli explanation, accusing Israel of deliberately targeting civilian and media presence to suppress coverage of the ongoing bombardment. Hamas issued a statement calling the hospital strike a war crime and vowed retaliation. The Gaza Health Ministry said that in the last 48 hours alone, more than 150 people had been killed across Gaza in a surge of airstrikes that have spared neither homes nor public institutions. Hospitals, schools, and refugee shelters have increasingly been struck, further straining the already collapsing health system. The United Nations has called for an independent investigation into the hospital bombing, stressing that medical facilities enjoy special protection under international law. Secretary General Guterres said he was deeply disturbed by the incident and urged restraint to prevent further escalation. Humanitarian agencies, including the Red Cross and SANS, condemned the strike, describing it as a severe blow to the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where food, water, and medical supplies are running out. The United States, Israel's closest ally, expressed sorrow at the loss of life but stopped short of outright condemnation. The White House said it expected Israel to conduct a transparent investigation and to share the findings with international partners. President Joe Biden said in a statement, "Hospitals must never be a target." The protection of journalists and humanitarian workers is a fundamental principle. Meanwhile, European Union leaders reacted more strongly, with France, Spain, and Ireland condemning the strike and calling for accountability. The deaths of journalists have underscored the risks faced by media professionals covering this war. Since the outbreak of the conflict last year, dozens of journalists have been killed, many of them Palestinian reporters working under extremely dangerous conditions. Media watchdogs argue that these repeated incidents cannot be dismissed as accidents and may point to a broader pattern of disregard for press safety. Families of the slain journalists describe their loved ones as heroes, who gave their lives to ensure that the world knew the truth about what was happening in Gaza. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the hospital strike is expected to worsen the humanitarian crisis in southern Gaza, where more than 1.5 million displaced people have been sheltering since. Northern areas were devastated by earlier operations. Nasser Hospital was one of the last remaining partially functioning facilities, and its partial destruction means thousands of wounded Palestinians may now go untreated. Doctors on the ground warn that without urgent international assistance, many of the injured would die from lack of care. In Khan Younis, grief and anger spilled onto the streets as families gathered for funerals. Mourners carried the bodies of journalists and doctors, wrapped in white shrouds, chanting against what they called Israeli aggression and international indifference. The atmosphere was one of despair, with many residents saying they had nowhere left to turn for safety. "If even hospitals are not safe, then where can we go?" asked Mahmoud Salem, a father who had been searching for his son in the rubble of the hospital. The incident is likely to further isolate Israel diplomatically, even as it insists it is fighting a just war against Hamas. Analysts say that the repeated targeting of civilian infrastructure is damaging Israel's international standing and may accelerate calls for sanctions or legal accountability. The International Criminal Court has already opened an investigation into potential war crimes in Gaza, and rights groups are expected to add the hospital strike to their list of cases. As the war shows no signs of abating, the people of Gaza remain trapped in an escalating cycle of violence. Monday's hospital strike will be remembered not just as a tragedy, but also as a stark reminder of the cost borne by civilians, medics, and journalists in modern conflict. The destruction of one of Gaza's last major hospitals represents a turning point that could have far-reaching consequences, both on the ground and in the international arena. For the families of those killed, no investigation or official statement can bring back their loved ones. But the deaths of journalists and doctors at Nasser Hospital ensure that this moment will not be forgotten. Their sacrifice underscores the brutal reality of a war in which even those trying to heal and tell the truth have become targets.